Hello and welcome to another episode of Talking Politics here at The Hindu with me, Nistula Hebbar, where we unpack the news making the headlines in domestic politics in all of last week. Well, in this episode, we'll be heading back up to the hill state of Uttarakhand, which saw third Chief Minister in the space of the first 7 months of this year and barely months away from elections to its assembly. We will look at why and how this change came about and what the BJP can expect in the coming months. In March this year, we saw a change at the helm in Uttarakhand, where Trivendra Singh Rawat was replaced by Tirath Singh Rawat. The earlier Mr. Rawat was considered unpopular among the party cadre and his ministers because he remained confined within a coterie of bureaucrats who seemed to be advising him and keeping him away from the things that his party and his cadre wanted him to do. The VHP and other Hindutva outfits were upset with him because they felt that by notifying the Char Dham Trusts Act, he was basically pushing the administration of around 52 Hindu shrines away from religious groups under the government's supervision, and other decisions that he made, like notifying a second capital for Gairsan, etc., made him deeply unpopular. And at that time, it was thought that since there was a year left for the assembly elections to take place, to effect a change there, to avoid a situation that had happened with the BJP in Jharkhand, where a deeply personally unpopular Chief Minister, Mr. Raghubar Das, was continued with, and the party paid the cost by losing that state. And therefore, Mr. Tirath Singh Rawat, who is a Lok Sabha MP, was brought in the place of Mr. Trivendra Singh Rawat in order to rectify a lot of what had happened before. When Mr. Tirath Singh Rawat took over in March of this year, he did reverse some of the more unpopular decisions of his predecessor. In his first cabinet meeting itself, he took back cases that had been filed for violation of COVID-19 protocol by people in the state. He also put up a review of the Char Dham Temple Trusts Act, which went a long way in soothing outraged Hindutva sentiments in the state, always very crucial for the BJP's electoral prospects. He also scrapped the second capital issue. But at the same time, his management of the Kumbh Mela came in for a lot of criticism. His statement that anybody was welcome to come for the Kumbh Mela, notwithstanding an RT-PCR test negative report, and the scandal that broke recently, that there were these fly-by-night labs or just fake labs which had given addresses of really seedy locations, etc., putting out fake RT-PCR certificates, people who had never been to the Kumbh getting SMSs saying that they had tested negative for COVID-19, etc. All of that got traced, and although Mr. Rawat ordered an inquiry, the situation ended up being a negative for him. But what bothered him most and the BJP was the legal limbo that he found himself in. In March, when he took over, the assembly elections for 4 states and 1 union territory were about to kind of get going, and then India entered the massive, very deathly second wave of COVID-19 pandemic. What happened during that time was that the Election Commission also got criticized for its conduct of polls in the middle of the second wave, of not keeping to COVID protocols, etc., and was criticized, in fact, by high courts. The Madras High Court especially came down quite heavily on the Election Commission. Therefore, the Election Commission is taking its own time for the conduct of Lok Sabha and even Rajya Sabha by polls, and it was felt that Mr. Rawat will not be able to get himself elected to the Uttarakhand Assembly, which is mandated by law to get done within 6 months of assuming office. That is, he assumed office in March, and therefore he would have had to get elected by September, early September this year, that he would not make it to the assembly within that deadline. Plus, rule in the Representation of People's Act, which said that by polls, that pertain, vacancies that pertain to whose term kind of is less than 1 year of the term left of the assembly in question will not take place. That is, the Uttarakhand Assembly, the life of this particular Uttarakhand Assembly is till March 2022, and therefore any by-poll would not be advisable. But there are, of course, ways of getting around it. But it was a legal limbo nevertheless. Things took a fast turn last week. After all of this, Mr. Rawat was summoned to Delhi. He hot-footed it down to meet with the party's high command. On Wednesday morning, he met with the party leaders late on Wednesday evening, where they told him that various legal options were being explored in order to get him out of this conundrum. But on Friday afternoon, when he met with BJP President JP Nadda, he was told in no uncertain terms that there seemed to be no honourable way out of this legal limbo, that they needed to get a Chief Minister who was a member of the Uttarakhand Assembly currently, and therefore he was advised to tender his resignation on his return to Dehradun, which he did. Significantly, there is another Chief Minister who is facing slightly the same conundrum, not exactly, but more or less the same conundrum, which is West Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee. Despite getting an absolute majority in the West Bengal Assembly, Ms. Banerjee lost her own assembly contest in Nandigram with Shuvendu Adhikari, who is now the leader of the opposition in the West Bengal Assembly. There are people who say that the BJP sacrificed Mr. Tirath Singh Rawat's career as Chief Minister in order to scalp a bigger target, which was Ms. Mamata Banerjee, saying that if by-polls cannot be held to save the seat of one Chief Minister, they shouldn't be held to save the seat of another. So Ms. Mamata Banerjee has time from, say, May to 6 months down the line, which would be November, and she may yet have to quit her position as Chief Minister if by-polls don't take place within that time. The jury is still out on that one, whether that was the intention of the BJP's high command or not. And whether or not by-polls are held is something to be seen. The Election Commission has said on various occasions that the Hindu spoke to them that they were still watching the COVID situation, on the number of cases, and whether it would be advisable for the conduct of any kind of polls at the moment. So we leave that particular bit where it is, but Mr. Tirath Singh Rawat then rushed back to Dehradun, tendered his resignation. The next day, Mr. Pushkar Dhami, the 11th Chief Minister to take oath, was elected as a leader of the BJP's legislative party. Mr. Narendra Singh Tomar and D. Purandareshwari were the central observers sent by the BJP for the safe conduct of those polls. Mr. Tomar said that Mr. Dhami was the only candidate. His name was proposed by his predecessor, Mr. Tirath Singh Rawat, and it was carried unanimously. So BJP kind of managed to sort out that issue for them, but to get a third Chief Minister in the space of 7 months is not exactly a signal that all is well, or that the BJP is politically comfortable in the hill state of Uttarakhand, which goes to polls next year. Therefore, the new Chief Minister has the same task cut out for him as his predecessor had, which was to make it into make the very, very fractious BJP unit in the state a fighting fit unit, to address concerns in the party, and to make sure that unlike his predecessor, he doesn't walk into too many controversies. Uttarakhand has had a fairly rocky ride as far as the tenures of its chief ministers have been concerned, but 3 in a year seems to be a record for that state as well. We leave this particular episode of Talking Politics at this point. We'd like to see what Mr. Dhami is up to in the next few months, the few months that he gets to be Chief Minister of the state, and of course, what happens to Uttarakhand, whether all these political gymnastics saved the BJP and returned it to power or not, will be something that we'll see next year. I'll join you again next week. Thank you.